There are stories that don't need noise or glamour, yet still have the power to move a soul. A billionaire who once walked in the glow of fame, seemingly owning everything in life. Until a small dog, abandoned on a rainy night, entered his world. The story below is not only about gratitude, it's a journey of rediscovering oneself through the light of love, not the spotlight of fame. If you love stories that touch the heart, hit follow on Heart Glow and turn on the notification bell, because I'll keep bringing you more beautiful stories like this, for you, the hearts that still feel deeply. It was raining. Not a quick downpour, but a long, cold rain, as if it would last an entire lifetime. The city was still as noisy as ever, though it was close to midnight. Car lights, horns, hurried footsteps. No one cared about anyone else. A luxury car rolled slowly down the streets, heading toward a mansion on the hill. Inside sat a man in his early 50s. Sharp features, neatly combed salt and pepper hair, eyes as cold as a rare gemstone. He was Edward Harrison, CEO of the state's largest tech conglomerate, hailed by the media as a living legend of the financial world. Suddenly, the sound. Very faint. Very weak. Yet strangely, it cut through the chaos and reached his ears clearly. He frowned. A cat? The driver started to pass by, but Edward motioned for him to stop. He rolled down the window, eyes narrowing toward an old trash bin by the roadside. The faint cry came again. Clearer this time, not a cat. Not a human, the breathing of a small creature, clinging to its final moments. Edward sighed. I just finished a tense meeting. I don't need this right now. But his feet moved on their own, stepping into the relentless rain. Inside the filthy bin, among plastic bags, leftover food containers, and a foul stench, was a small creature curled up tight, a puppy. Barely 6 months old, maybe less. Its fur was soaked and matted. A long gash on its hind leg was bleeding. It trembled, trying to lift its head to see the man standing before it. Its eyes, not begging, but pleading. No barking. No whimpering. Just a look, a gaze that pierced straight into Edward's heart. He froze for a moment. A strange feeling stirred, one he hadn't felt in years, not pity. Not guilt, but something fragile brushing the shadowed corners of his soul. They really left you here? He whispered. The puppy blinked. Still unmoving, too tired to even be afraid, Edward took off his designer coat and gently wrapped it around the dog, lifting it into his arms. The puppy nestled into his chest. Softly, but fully present, a shiver ran through him, for the first time in years. Something stirred inside his chest. Back in the car, the driver stared. Sir. You're bringing that dog home. Edward said nothing, his gaze still on the small bundle in his arms. A night like this, if I leave it, it'll die. His voice was calm, but it hit like an arrow to the heart. At the mansion, the butler was alarmed to see Edward walk in with a filthy dog. Prepare warm water, clean towels, and a vet, he ordered, offering no explanation. That whole night, he stayed by the dog, watching every bandage, every tiny groan that seemed to beg for life. He didn't know why he cared so much. Maybe it had just been too long since anyone needed him for anything other than his wealth. The next morning, the puppy looked a bit better. It lay curled in a clean towel, occasionally peeking at Edward. He sat nearby, sipping coffee as he did every morning, but for the first time, he didn't open his laptop. He looked at the dog and said, "You're lucky, little guy. You could have died, but you met the right person." He paused, then chuckled softly. How about I call you Lucky? Sounds ironic, but it fits. The puppy looked up, not understanding, but less afraid than yesterday. From that moment on, the puppy had a name. And Edward had a friend for the first time in years. In the days that followed, Lucky became part of the home, not noisy or demanding, just present. He lay by Edward's feet during work. Slept in the corner when he rested, no fuss. No expectations. But always there, Edward, a man who once signed billion-dollar deals and led thousands of employees, now fumbled trying to prepare milk for a puppy. He learned to pet him. To look into his eyes. To speak even though he knew the dog didn't understand, yet somehow, Edward felt heard. Lucky didn't speak, but never left his side, and Edward, still cold on the outside, was changing in ways even he couldn't see. Coming home no longer felt empty, waking up no longer felt lonely, just a small creature. But it warmed a heart that had long turned to ice. After a few weeks of careful care, Lucky had recovered significantly. His once filthy fur was now shiny and clean, the wound on his hind leg had healed, leaving only a small scar, a reminder of the hardship he had endured, but the most profound change was in his eyes. Lucky's gaze was no longer filled with panic and fear. Every day, he looked at Edward with absolute trust, as if the man was his entire world. No matter where Edward went in the house, Lucky would quietly follow, like a small, silent shadow, even when Edward worked for hours on end. Lucky never left. He would simply curl up under the desk, dozing off. One time, Edward nearly stepped on him at the door. He paused, gently patted Lucky. "Sorry, kid. I'm not used to having someone around." Lucky didn't mind. He wagged his tail softly, as if to say, "It's okay. I'm used to it." Edward had always lived by a strict schedule. His life used to be filled with meetings, contracts, partners, and investments. His time was more precious than gold, but ever since Lucky came into his life, things began to change, slowly but surely. Instead of jumping into emails first thing in the morning, he spent 10 quiet minutes petting Lucky. Instead of eating dinner alone in silence, he let Lucky sit beside him, even if the dog only nibbled on kibble. Instead of drowning in stress, he would occasionally laugh when Lucky tried to climb onto the sofa and slid off, and for the first time in 20 years. He started going for evening walks. He didn't like talking to people, but he talked to Lucky every day. "What do you think, kid? Should I invest in this project? Looks like the board hated my idea. How about a movie night tonight?" No one answered. But he felt heard, maybe. Because love doesn't need words. Edward's mansion had always been quiet, almost cold. The butler, the staff, the guards, all worked like machines because their boss was known to dislike disruptions. But since Lucky arrived, something shifted. The old butler, who had worked with Edward for nearly 20 years, smiled quietly when he saw his boss napping on the sofa with Lucky in his arms. The cleaning staff started buying little toys for the pup. Even the chef, who had never cooked for anyone besides Edward, secretly made a special dish for Lucky every Sunday morning. One day, when Lucky got a stomachache from overeating, the whole mansion was in a panic. Edward cradled him in his arms, rushing around to find a vet, murmuring, "Don't scare me, Lucky. You're everything I have now." No one knew exactly when. But the little dog had become the heart of the house, in a world of contracts, negotiations, and calculating eyes. Edward had always distrusted people, not out of spite, but because he was too used to deceit. But Lucky didn't know how to pretend. He didn't care whether Edward was rich or poor, successful or broken. Even when Edward was busy, irritable, or silent, Lucky remained by his side, like a loyal friend. No conditions. No expectations. Edward used to wonder, if I lost all my money, who would stay by my side? Then he looked at Lucky, sleeping peacefully at his feet, one look. And he knew the answer. Slowly, Edward stopped thinking only about stock prices and bank accounts. He started to feel joy when Lucky learned how to ring the doorbell. He felt touched when Lucky licked his hand each night like a bedtime ritual, and sometimes, he quietly stared out the window, thinking, what have I truly lived for all these years? How could such a small creature make me feel more complete than any luxury ever has? Love, loyalty, gratitude. Were those the things I'd lost along the way? Edward didn't have an answer right away. But he knew one thing: ever since Lucky walked into his life, everything had changed, and he had started to slow down, to feel again, the little things that turned out to be more precious than an empire. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue, we would love to hear your thoughts and reflections in the comments section below. If you find this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it to support the channel and help spread kindness and love to those around you. We hope you have a truly heartfelt listening experience. It was a rainy night. Edward had just returned from the office after a tense meeting. His car was speeding down the highway when a truck ahead suddenly lost control. The driver tried to brake hard, but it was too late. A deafening crash echoed through the darkness. Everything went black in an instant. When Edward woke up in the hospital, the world around him was dim, not because the lights were off, but because he could no longer see. The doctors said, trauma to the brain had severely damaged his optic nerves. We're very sorry, Mr. Edward, you've completely lost your vision. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Edward couldn't believe it. A man who once saw every business opportunity could no longer see the world at all. After the accident, the news spread like wildfire. Billionaire Edward permanently loses his sight. At first, visitors came in droves. There were flowers. There were wishes. Even fake hugs, but week after week, the phone stopped ringing. The letters stopped arriving. The partners who once bowed before him quietly withdrew. The board of directors slowly stripped him of power, citing the need to protect the company's image. Friends faded away. Employees whispered, "It's sad, but he's not the same anymore." Edward sat alone in his vast mansion. No light. No laughter, only the sound of his own sighs, and a hollow emptiness in his soul. He once thought losing sight was just the loss of a sense. But no, it was the loss of everything he thought he was. No one stayed. Except for Lucky. Even when Edward could no longer see, he still knew Lucky was there, curled up by his feet, breathing softly and warmly. Every morning, Lucky still licked his hand, a silent greeting. "I'm still here. Don't be afraid." Edward once shouted, "Go away. I don't need anyone." Lucky just sat there, eyes full of sadness, but he didn't leave. He wasn't scared of the yelling, never angry, never resentful, just quietly stayed. When Edward knocked over his coffee, Lucky ran to lick up every drop, trying to help. When Edward got lost in his own house, Lucky gently nudged him in the right direction. And at night, in the cold silence, Lucky climbed into his arms, like a small fire warming his broken heart. There were nights Edward stayed awake, not from physical pain, but from the despair gnawing at his chest. He used to be a legend, leading thousands, commanding billions. Now, he couldn't even dress himself or step outside without help. "I'm just a burden. What's the point of living anymore?" he whispered one stormy night. But just then, Lucky came over, nudged his hand with his nose. Then he lay across Edward's legs, curled up, breathing steadily, as if to say, "If you give up, who will stay with me?" Every morning, he still woke up on time and gently gnawed on Edward's hand with a soft, familiar lick. No words. No demands. Just presence, and that presence, like a fragile thread, pulled Edward back from the edge. One morning, Edward sat on the sofa, Lucky lying beside him. Through the window, birdsong floated in, a sound he'd never noticed before. A question stirred in his heart: is light really only found in the eyes? He began sensing the world through what he had left. Lucky came near, he knew, from the soft click of nails on the floor. Lucky was sad, he knew, from the slow, gentle lick on his hand. Lucky was happy, he knew, from the excited wagging of his tail nearby. And suddenly, Edward realized, the light that guides a life isn't the light of the sun, but the light from a soul that knows how to love, how to wait, and how to stay when the whole world walks away. After a long time living in despair, Edward finally made a decision. He would not let darkness consume his life. Though he could no longer see, he could still feel the beating of his heart and the steady breath of the little dog by his side. Lucky, Edward began to learn how to adapt to the darkness. No longer a powerful CEO, he became a student of life itself. Every morning, he groped his way forward, each step small but full of determination. Lucky was always by his side, patient and alert. When Edward bumped into the edge of a table, Lucky would turn and lick his hand, as if to encourage him. When Edward got lost in his own home, Lucky would silently lead the way, gentle yet steady. Gradually, Edward learned to listen to the world through sound, the wind, the birds, and Lucky's footsteps. He learned to sense light through things that didn't require sight, through the warm presence of his loyal dog. Once a man who raced through life under the spotlight, Edward now lived more slowly, learning to trust and to let go. Edward knew that if he wanted to keep living, he couldn't just rely on instinct. He invited a guide dog trainer to teach Lucky special skills. At first, the training wasn't easy. Lucky was still young, sometimes playful, but strangely, Lucky learned quickly, as if he understood how important he was to his owner. Within just a few weeks, Lucky knew to stop at staircases, gently pull the leash when obstacles appeared, and guide Edward away from collisions. More than just a guide, Lucky learned to respond to Edward's emotions. When Edward breathed quickly from anxiety, Lucky gently pressed his head against his leg. When Edward sighed in exhaustion, Lucky wagged his tail and licked his hand as if to recharge him. The little dog became a soulmate, a living emotional sensor. Edward began to believe that love didn't need words, just a touch, a breath was enough to understand. Every time Lucky calmly led him from his office to the balcony, Edward silently thanked fate for bringing this dog into his life. On his first day stepping outside after the accident, Edward trembled like a child. The world out there felt larger and more chaotic than ever before. No more familiar lights, no sense of control, only sounds and Lucky led the way gently. One step ahead, the leash taut like a quiet whisper, "Trust me." Edward heard the rustling leaves, the laughter of children in the nearby park. Every sound became vivid and alive, as if the world was being redefined. At times he froze, afraid to fall, and Lucky would turn and nudge his leg with his head, a gentle but powerful encouragement, stronger than any words. The familiar neighbors began to notice. Everyone was surprised to see the once famous CEO now walking slowly with a small dog. But no one laughed, for in that image was a quiet strength, a rare kind of beauty. Though his steps were unsteady, Edward's heart was no longer lost. One gentle rainy night, Edward sat by the window with a pen in hand and a blank notebook in front of him. He no longer wrote with the sharp gaze of a strategist. This time, he wrote with his heart, and the emotions had never felt so raw. The first line read, "I once had everything, but never knew what I truly needed." He wrote about the feeling of touching Lucky's head every morning, like a healing ritual. wrote about the pain of not seeing his face in the mirror, yet still sensing light through the presence of his dog. He didn't write for others to read, but to understand himself. Each page was a step toward rebirth. A new breath in a life once thought extinguished. Slowly, the pages filled, not with business strategies, but with fragments of love. He realized, what gives a person true worth isn't found at the peak of power, but in how we face life when we've lost everything. One morning, Edward sat on a wooden chair in the backyard. There was no sunshine, just a soft breeze brushing his graying hair. Lucky lay at his feet, head resting on his hand. Peaceful, without a word, Edward whispered, "I used to live as if only light meant life. But now," he knew, "there are things only felt in darkness." Lucky was a silent teacher, a light that never faded within his soul, thanks to this little dog. He realized a simple yet profound truth: when we fall, just having someone who doesn't leave is enough to stand back up. Lucky didn't just guide his steps, he guided his blind heart. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to perform miracles, just needed to be there, every day. Thanks to Lucky, Edward saw himself again, not as the CEO of a corporation, but as a man living fully in every moment, with gratitude and love. After many sleepless nights, Edward realized he couldn't keep this story to himself. He began to use his wealth, once a symbol of power, to plant seeds of new hope. With the support of a few loyal friends, he founded the Lucky Light Foundation. The foundation's name was a tribute to Lucky, the dog who lit up his world when everything was shrouded in darkness. Its mission focused on two things: supporting the blind and rescuing abandoned animals. Edward wanted no one to be alone in the dark, as he once was. He invested in guide dog training programs, aiming to improve the lives of the visually impaired across the United States. He also built a network of animal rescue shelters, where abandoned dogs and cats could be cared for and eventually find new homes. Everywhere he went, he carried the foundation's motto: light comes from love. Though he no longer had eyes to see, he had never seen his life path more clearly. Edward began accepting invitations to speak at conferences, schools, and community centers. Guiding him, as always, was Lucky, now a beloved companion in the public eye. Whenever he stepped onto a stage, he didn't need notes. He spoke from the heart. He shared the story of a cold winter night, when he found Lucky in a trash bin, a tiny, fragile life radiating quiet resilience. He spoke of the greatest fall of his life, and the greatest lesson it taught him. Every auditorium would fall silent as he recounted his darkest moments, and tears would flow as he described how Lucky pulled him back into the light. He never tried to be an inspirational speaker, he simply told the truth, and it was that truth that moved thousands of hearts. He had once been blind in both body and soul. Now, he was illuminated by the purest kind of loyalty. His message spread not through numbers or flashy presentations, but through the quiet, steady breath of love he carried in every word. People began to speak of Lucky as a symbol of loyalty and unconditional love. On social media, images of the small black dog walking beside an old man in dark glasses went viral. Children drew pictures of Lucky, while adults turned his story into moral lessons. No one called Lucky just a dog anymore, they called him the friend who saved a man. Animal shelters named their rescue programs after him, a chance for light. Lucky never spoke, but his eyes, his steadiness, and his loyalty became the language of miracles. Edward often hugged Lucky and whispered, "You're not a pet, you're the light life gave to me." A statue of Lucky was placed at the foundation's entrance, a reminder that love is the greatest power of all. No one ever taught Lucky how to be a hero, he simply followed his heart, and that made him extraordinary in a way no words could ever fully describe. The story of Edward and Lucky sparked a new wave, a wave of compassion. In big cities, adoption rates for abandoned animals soared, families began welcoming tiny lives like Lucky into their homes, not just to own them, but to live with them. On online forums, people shared touching moments with dogs who had once been forgotten. They learned to slow down, to pause and stroke a small head, to listen to the soft breathing of a sleeping dog. A fresh breeze swept through society, love. Like a dog, without conditions, without expectations. People once trapped by ambition and success began to rethink what truly matters. They looked at Edward, a man who had everything. Then lost it all, and ultimately found himself again thanks to a small creature. No complicated moral lectures were needed, just one loyal gaze could change a heart. Lucky didn't just change Edward, he changed how the world sees love. One autumn evening, Edward sat on a wooden bench behind the rescue center. Lucky rested his head on Edward's lap, eyes half closed in contentment. A soft breeze passed by, carrying the scent of wildflowers. Edward smiled, a true smile, the first in many years. He thought of the past, of the days he had chased success and forgotten his own heart. Now, he could no longer see, but he saw more clearly than ever. He understood, giving love never made him poorer, it made him richer every day. Love doesn't need eyes to be seen, it only needs a heart that knows how to feel. His life was once shrouded in darkness, but now, he was the one bringing light to others. And that light didn't come from money, power, or fame, it came from Lucky. And from the unconditional love he had learned through him. 5 years had passed since the life-altering incident. Edward now lived in a small wooden cabin on the edge of a forest, far removed from the noisy hustle of the city. There were no more tense meetings, no more flooded inboxes, only the morning songs of birds and the scent of wild grass after night rain. Every morning, he would open the door, take a deep breath, and feel the cool breeze brush through his graying hair. Lucky was always by the doorstep, tail gently wagging as he heard Edward's footsteps. The house was simple but full of life, tiny potted plants on the windowsill, the laughter of neighborhood children who came to play with Lucky, and a bookshelf filled with Braille books that Edward read by touch. There was no TV, no social media, only a peace he had once desperately longed for. In the evenings, Edward and Lucky would sit by the fireplace. He'd strum a few chords on his old guitar while Lucky rested his head on his lap. That little home was their entire world. There. Edward no longer needed eyes, for his heart had learned to see the most precious things. Each day, he wrote a few lines in his Braille journal about the sunrise, the sound of sparrows, or simply how he felt about Lucky. And when night fell and the wind rustled through the leaves, he'd smile and whisper, "Today, I truly lived." The world once knew Edward as a powerful and wealthy man, but he no longer needed that title. The vast fortune he once owned had been transferred into charitable foundations serving the community. Edward chose to quietly step away from the spotlight, living anonymously among farmers' markets, small-town grocery stores, and roadside cafes. Yet, strangely, he had never felt so rich. His wealth now wasn't measured in savings or stocks, but in every hug from Lucky and every smile from a child he helped. Whenever someone came to visit, Edward would greet them with a pot of warm tea and heartfelt stories. They didn't come because he was a CEO, but because he was the blind man with a warm heart and a loyal dog. Every month, he still sent out Braille books and assistive devices to the blind, gifts from the unnamed friend. To him, joy was simple, listening to a babbling brook, or feeling Lucky's paw resting against his leg. He understood this: the love you give always returns to you in an even more beautiful form. As time passed, not only did Edward grow older, Lucky, his loyal four-legged friend, also began to slow down. His once white fur had turned speckled gray, and his legs trembled more after each long nap. But every morning, when Edward stepped outside with his familiar cane, Lucky still made the effort to rise, wag his tail, and walk beside him, just like the old days. There were no more energetic sprints or booming barks, only steady breathing beside him. As if to say, "I'm still here." Edward felt every breath from Lucky like a ticking clock, treasuring each moment. On days Lucky was tired, Edward held him close, stroking his fur gently, silently thanking him for all he had done. Together, they strolled slowly around the hill, not caring about the destination, just grateful to have each other. The townsfolk were familiar with the image, a blind man with a cane, and a gentle hand resting on the back of an aging dog. In those moments, Edward didn't cry, but in his heart, a warm current flowed endlessly. That evening, the sky turned a soft orange as the last rays of sunlight blanketed the dry grass. Edward sat on an old wooden bench on the porch, listening to the wind and smelling the earthy scent after a morning rain. Lucky lay beside him, head resting on his lap, breath slow and steady. Edward's hand gently stroked Lucky's back, each movement full of emotion, as if trying to pour all his gratitude through his fingertips. "Thank you for never leaving me," he whispered, voice trembling with emotion. Lucky softly licked his hand, his clouded eyes still full of love. In that moment, no music was needed, no words, only the presence of two souls who had saved each other. Edward's heart felt full, not because of grand success, but because he had lived, had loved, and had been loved in return. They sat like that, under the twilight sky, saying nothing more, for nothing else needed to be said. Down a small dirt road, two familiar silhouettes slowly moved toward the sunset, a man with a white cane, and an old dog walking silently beside him. Their steps were no longer strong, but steady, blending into the soft golden light of day's end. In the distance, the laughter of children and the rustle of falling leaves created a gentle farewell symphony. No one knew where they were headed, only that they were together. It was the end, not of a goodbye, but of a complete journey. From a lonely, ambitious CEO to a blind man who learned to see with his heart. From a discarded stray dog to a lifelong companion. The story needed no dramatic climax, no tears, because the quiet warmth of their bond had already touched every heart. And as the last sunbeam disappeared behind the mountains, people could still see two silhouettes, man and dog, standing as eternal symbols of love, gratitude, and salvation. Life is a journey full of turmoil, where we may lose everything, fame, fortune, even the light in our eyes. But sometimes, in those very losses, we find the most precious things, a healed soul, unconditional love, and a reason to keep going. Edward and Lucky's story isn't just about a man and a dog, it is living proof that when the heart still knows how to love, any darkness can be overcome. Now, Edward no longer walks under stage lights or corporate spotlights. He walks beneath golden evening skies, with Lucky by his side, two souls that have weathered every storm. Their friendship needs no words, no conditions, just loyalty, deep understanding, and a love that defies time. The story ends on a quiet road, where every step is bathed in golden twilight. But for those who followed their journey, this isn't an ending, it's a new beginning, to slow down, to love more, and to realize that true happiness doesn't come from what we have, but how we live with one another. If this story has touched your heart, please don't forget to like, share it with those you care about, and subscribe to Heart Glow, where stories of healing are told, and the light within you is rekindled by the simplest, most beautiful things. Heart Glow, where every story brings healing, and where your light is awakened from within. See you on the next journey.